So the idea today, well, thanks to everybody before we get started. DLD has been fantastic so far, and I want to thank everybody who's involved. The idea is we're going to have a conversation about telecommunications, but since I'm much more interested in what René is doing, I will steer the conversation more towards Deutsche Telekom, T-Mobile, and all these products that you see around the world. Before we get started, René, what I thought you would like, I know, you run an empire of 230,000 people around the world and 60 billion in revenues, but why don't you give everyone a sense of the global presence, the global footprint of Deutsche Telekom?
Sure. First of all, thanks for the invitation. I'm happy not to have to deliver a speech as usual. Thank you for convincing me. Telecom is present in about 30 markets now, and our main business has become the mobile business, mobile part of it. However, we still operate in a number of countries, first and foremost in Germany, a fairly large fixed line network, which is also a very big employer because that division has about 80,000 people in Germany alone. And we operate fixed line in some other markets as well. And we have a system business which is focused on network-centric ICT services, primarily in outsourcing and IT management.
And do you notice, or have you started noticing now as a result of the crisis, do you think the telecom sector, compared to other industries like the car industry, the housing industry, the computer industry, do you feel kind of lucky to be in telecoms, or you feel telecoms is getting as hurt as everyone else?
I think we are blessed in that industry so far. First of all, in recent economic downturns, a few years ago, for instance, in the 2001, 2002, the mobile industry was very resilient, but you could argue the market was still very young. But even now, I think the current situation offers even opportunities for us, i.e. in the outsourcing area. We see demand is actually growing, and that part of the business still grows. But I also think mobile and personal communication as such is high on people's priority list. And if you look at their total, the share of their net income, it's like 2 or 3%. So before they give that up, they would give other things up. And therefore, we are seeing still quite a good business.
And considering that the German government still owns 30% of Deutsche Telekom, and at the same time, Deutsche Telekom is such an important actor in Germany with like 60 billion in revenues. Do they call you up from the government in Germany when they're making plans to help the economy? Do they ask your opinion? And if so, maybe do you have an opinion as to what this country should do to avoid getting into a worse recession?
Well, first of all, the government has consulted with industry leaders quite early, and they've been in a very intense dialogue. So we were part of that. And in fact, I would suggest that we can also be part of the solution because we're making significant investments globally. And about 50% of our total investments, or 45%, go into Germany because we still have a large obligation to do the further rollout of the fixed line network. And if you think about the contribution of ICT, or as we call this industry, it's very significant. In the past, it's been 40% of all the productivity growth came from directly or indirectly from our sector. So we are part of the solution going forward. And therefore, yes, we've been part of the consultation process. We made suggestions for making more investments into our sector.
Can you give us some examples?
Significant, yes. Significant investments. We have, for instance, we believe that we should cover the country very fast with broadband. And I don't mean snail band, I mean broadband, because current definition of broadband is everything beyond 384 kilos. That's ridiculous, that's not broadband.
So what do you call broadband? Is fiber? Fiber optics or fiber with
2
Ethernet?
megabit per second, you can do that via DSL, you can do it even via mobile. If finally regulators decide to allow for the spectrum, the digital dividend spectrum, to be reutilized and reallocated so we can build fast mobile networks as a complementary access, high-speed access to landline.
Sorry, I never heard that expression. Digital dividend spectrum?
Yeah, that's an expression we're using here. That's basically, in the past, terrestrial broadcasting has had about 400 megahertz of spectrum, and that is less and less useful for that category, and that can be reallocated, at least to a large extent, for reutilization for mobile operators, so they can cover, with true broadband, they can cover areas which are too costly to be covered with landline. So part of the solution is additional investments into covering the country, rolling out 2 megabit plus very fast, and also to start making the investments in VDSL/fiber to the curb, fiber to the home.
And how does it feel?
It does require a different regulatory environment.
I've been using T-Mobile. In fact, I'm a customer of T-Mobile, but not in Germany, in the United States.
Good choice.
I have a home there, and I have found that T-Mobile is very innovative in the States. Like, they start with the Android, they give you a Wi-Fi router with free phone calls, they give you a BlackBerry with global roaming for $60 a month, so I don't pay any more roaming when I don't find Wi-Fi. But why? I've seen that some of these products are not offered in Germany, or what is the difference between being a contender and being a defender of the market?
Well, first of all, you also see the other way around. We have some services and offerings which we offer here, which we are not yet selling in the US, i.e. Web and Walk. We started here, we roll it out. We have 5 million users now in Europe for mobile internet access under that platform. And or the iPhone we have in some European markets, Germany and other markets, which we don't have in the US. And also we're rolling out the Google device next week in Germany. So I think there is a mutual exchange of innovation, and we have established innovation processes now which allow us to work between the US and Europe more and more successfully. But generally speaking, we had to learn a number of lessons in Europe, which we had been able to learn as a small organization in the US earlier. As a challenger, you are kind of forced to, whereas as an organization which is as big and successful initially, or where the money came in, like in the past, in DT, it was more difficult to learn that it's about innovation.
And is it easier? How would you define the relationship? Like you have, when you meet, let's say, Ivan Seidenberg, who runs Verizon, you probably met him, and people who the CEO of AT&T, or do you find the environment in America to be tougher or maybe easygoing compared to the environment in Europe? How is the relationship of very large telecom companies in Europe compared to America?
Well, in a way it's tougher and in a way it's easier. I would suggest that in Europe the situation is fairly unsustainable. If you look at the US, there are 4 national big companies running broadband networks in mobile. And in Europe, the situation is highly fragmented. In some small markets like Austria or wherever, you have 4 or even 5 different carriers, and there are enormous consolidation barriers, and it takes you 9 months or so to get permission to, or it took in the past a long time to get permission to consolidate. So the US, with a market of 300 million people, only 4 big carriers, is a more consolidated market already. But on the other side, the US has always been very competitive and very consumer-orientated, very marketing-driven, and you could see that in the tariff models. They were at a very early stage already geared towards high usage, consumer-focused, and kind of easy to understand, whereas in Europe you had a wide array of tariffs which were too complex, too much clutter, too much small print, so not very consumer-friendly. So I think in that regard, Europe is learning a lesson very fast. US more consumer-centric, very competitive, very marketing-driven. Europe, on the other side, a very difficult market environment for carriers because just too many of them around.
And as a consumer, if you had to have a home in Berlin or a home in New York City, where do you think you get better service?
Say that again?
Between having a home, in Berlin or in New York City, let's say as a consumer, where do you think people are better off as consumers? Are they better off in the States or in Europe? And to give a precise example...
No, I understand the question. They're best off with T-Mobile.
Whatever they are. But my
let's
phone
face-
calls get cut off a lot with T-Mobile in the States.
Not in
but
New
not
York,
in
though.
Europe.
Look, let's face reality. New York is one of the most difficult environments to manage because of all the skyscrapers and the enormous density. And the US, you know, people use their mobile device like 1,000 minutes or so a month. Europe is a fraction of that. Even in the UK or in some very high usage market is much less than the US. So New York is very, very difficult to manage. Nonetheless, I think the service in New York has become much, much better over the last 12, 24 months. And I'm also going there quite often. I'm fairly happy now with the service. But Berlin is easier to manage.
And going back to Deutsche Telekom and the numbers, the finances of Deutsche Telekom, in the last few years, you went from having, you know, almost a loss or a very small cash flow. Cash flow's been growing, I understand, to around 6 billion now and 60 billion in revenues. Do you have any sense of what the crisis may do to the finances of Deutsche Telekom?
All right, first of all, you're right that we said last year we will do the same result as the previous year, which is around 19.3 billion in operational results and about 6.6 in cash flow. And we're very confident that we can, you know, report along the lines and match those targets. So we're lucky.
So you really don't feel it will have an effect on Deutsche Telekom?
No, I said, first of all, I'm confident looking into 2009. Yes. I say that we can do about the same result or even a slight better result as we forecasted the result to be last year. So that's a good situation to be in at the moment. And that's because of what the industry overall looks like, that it's fairly resilient against crisis, but it's also due to the fact that over the last 2 years, we made our homework. We restructured the business in many respects. We took about 4 billion almost costs out of the operation. And we really, you know, restructured our portfolio to some extent. We just did a lot of things in order to become more competitive, and that is the second cause for that situation. And we are very solidly financed. Our free cash flow, our liquidity reserves are very high, about 40% of our net debts. So we're in a good situation, but that's also a result of the last couple of years of restructuring.
And which companies have you acquired in the last year, and what kind of companies would you think of buying?
First of all, we rebuilt our portfolio and we disposed of a number of fringe activities which were not considered core, i.e. media broadcast, where other companies can do much better than we can because it's not our core business, or the property division with about 6,000 people recently. And we acquired a number of operations along the line of our strategy, which is to grow abroad in mobile. So we acquired a business in the US, we acquired a business in the Netherlands, Orange. We recently acquired a stake in Greece at OT, which gives us coverage into 5 additional Central European markets. And the total acquisition sum was about 6 to 7 billion plus the assumption of some of the debt of those companies. So,
and how are those decisions made at Deutsche Telekom? Like, people bring these deals to you. Are you very much on the internet yourself looking at things and you say, hey, why don't we look at this? Why don't we look at that? Or would you say you're more of a strategist and you wait to be confronted with a menu of choices and you say, let's go for this one?
Well, we are in the lucky situation to have a number of people who are very active out there searching for opportunities. And the team and myself, you know, we sit together and discuss things on a regular basis because strategy is an ongoing process. So it's not that we do strategy once a year. We do it basically in weekends or so every 2 or 3 months. So we sit together and discuss and weigh our opportunities against and make the priorities. But we have a long-term strategy, and the long-term strategy is really to improve our competitiveness in Germany and to grow abroad, because it's very difficult for us to grow in Germany, given the trend, deregulation, and so forth.
And this is a different question. It relates more to sort of global economics. But in a small scale at FON, at my company, we were really hurt by the collapse of the pound. Like, our pound revenues in euros went down like 20, 30%. And I imagine that at your level, managing dollar revenues, pound revenues, euro revenues, yes, and some Eastern European countries and so on, what is your view of currencies, and do you think there anything could be done to make the world a safer place for business vis-a-vis currencies?
Well, let's use an example. I consider the euro, and I'm not sure how you feel about it, but I consider the euro a great thing. Not
No, I
only
agree.
because it makes our life easier, but it makes doing business easier. And I consider the euro a very strong currency, and I hope, even though the crisis currently is a big temptation to keep, increase debt and so forth, but I hope that the euro stays a very strong currency. And last year we were suffering from a weak US dollar. In comparison to the previous year, a few hundred million. It cost us more than $1 billion in revenues in translation from dollar to euro, and also the profitability got hit. But nonetheless, we kept our guidance intact and we compensated. So, of course, if you just have one currency, it makes planning and running a business easier. I just don't think it's going to be feasible in the near future. We
Yes.
can't hedge currencies because we're not a company which produces and sells and has steady streams of revenue. It's basically for us translation risk, right? Our revenues and our profits in the US are kept in the US more or less, and therefore we're not hedging.
And when I was building Viatel, this was in the 90s, and we invented this thing known as callback. I wrote an article like in 1995 that was called The Death of the Minute. And I thought that pricing per minute would disappear in the 90s. And it hasn't, right? People still talk of minutes. And the other thing people do is they talk of borders, like Schengen exists, but your mobile operator ignores Schengen and thinks that somehow there is a border between here and France that deserves maybe a 10 times hike in your data rates or things like that. Yeah. Do you think that minutes and roaming will eventually disappear, like I used to think, or do you think they're here to stay?
First of all, we're in the same boat. You wrote in 95 that mobile minutes will disappear, and you may be right, it just takes 10 years longer than you thought. I was of the belief that mobile internet will be here in 2002, 2003, and I was wrong. It'll be here, it's now here, it's coming. So sometimes we overestimate the ability of this industry to adapt to customer needs very fast, okay? Number two, mobile minutes or the charging by small unitization in general, could be a minute, could be 10 kilobyte, those things will disappear and it's more user-friendly whilst we talk. Every day there is a new tariff model which is more like another bundle or a big bucket or an option or here, this, that, the other thing. Nonetheless, bear in mind that roaming, as the second example, has a lot to do with, there is some imbalance. Some markets benefit a lot, like Spain, so they get more traffic in, then they export their traffic from their customers. And therefore, so not everybody's on the same page when it comes to the interests. I think the roaming over time is going to be much more user-friendly anyway, driven by competition, driven by every one of us needs to differentiate more, so we'll use roaming also as a means to make better propositions and to differentiate ourselves against our competitors. It's just a matter of time.
Now switching to social networks, I hosted an event, Facebook Developers Garage, for Mark Zuckerberg in Madrid a few months ago, and I asked Mark what he thought, or how did he see Facebook? What did he think Facebook was? And he did not think it was a social network. In fact, the more he spoke, it sounded like Facebook was either something like an operating system for getting along, or like a telecom operator. I was very surprised because he saw Facebook as a tool for connecting people, just almost the Nokia slogan, connecting people. It sounded like he was, and there's a lot of cross-breeding. For example, Apple did the iPhone, and people who try to come into telecoms, and so on. Do you think of all the customers of T-Mobile as some kind of social network, or do you think that there's more that could be done to get the customers of T-Mobile to feel as if they're part of a social network?
I think they're part of a huge number of social networks, and the proof of the pudding is that last year I think it was about 13, 14 or 15 billion short messages which have been transported over that very network. And more people keep their devices always on. if you look at kids' behavior these days, you know, I have a 14-year-old daughter. She's constantly sending text, receiving messages. She does that from her home PC. She does that from her mobile device, and it's all more and more intertwined now. So I think T-Mobile customers are part of a huge community, but eventually that community is global and therefore has to be subdivided into a vast number of many small communities, friends, and so forth. I think social networks will have more and more ability to also be used as communication platforms. For instance, in Facebook, you can now send text from your Facebook right into the T-Mobile network, or you can even make calls. So he may be right. I don't know. It's the customer choice eventually.
And did you think of buying when, for example, StudiVZ, the German Facebook social community type product, was for sale? Did you think of buying it, or was that not part of it?
No, because
so you wouldn't want to
we
go
would
into
like
that
to be,
space?
Well, I wouldn't categorically say no, but I think our big strength is we can be a great partner to many companies, and we don't want to tie ourselves just to one. And usually what happens is if you buy one, then you kind of are prejudiced what you're selling. And we want our customers to have more choice, and therefore we partner and we sell our pre-products, such as location information also, or to those companies, rather than being completely vertically integrated.
Very well. I was thinking that maybe if you have some questions that you may want to think about, I'm going to ask about that in a second. Now, when you think of Deutsche Telekom, do you think Germany first, then the US, or then Central Europe? Or how do you think of the company in terms of priorities globally?
Right. As of today, we are in 30 markets, even outside of Europe, outside of the US, but our prime revenue sources and margin sources are clearly Germany with about 40%, the US is about 25%, Central Europe is about 20% or so, and then the rest comes from other markets. So we are fairly split now into 3 geographical zones plus some smaller markets. And I think on the very long run that, you know, our idea is to become one of the leaders in connected life and work, and we also, I believe, need scale. So I'm not suggesting that we will precipitate into some M&A in these days, but like look 10 years down the road, I think we will use opportunities to grow our business further. And definitely with 40% Germany, it's still a strong part of the organization, but it's not and it shouldn't be a German-dominated, German-centric company or just that, it's more than that.
And what do you think about the way Telefonica has been managed?
I don't talk about my competitors. If I look at our stock price, we've done recently, comparing ourselves to our index and to our competitors, we've done well. For the first time in the last 6 months, we even outperformed our index, and the index is made up by all of our key competitors. So I can say happily now that at least the investor community considers DT a good choice. So
Very
that's
good.
what matters.
Are there any questions that you would like to ask? Yes.
One thing that I wanted to ask you about, one of the big problems I see in the traditional internet and also in the mobile internet up to today is payment. Credit card payment in my eyes is, first of all, very expensive, particularly for small companies to integrate. It's not really safe. We've been talking about mobile payment for many years, and I come from Switzerland. They just started that at some candy bar distribution machines that you simply plug in your mobile number and then it charges through your mobile device. But are we going to see something like this on a broader scale in the future? What do you think about that?
No, I think so, because particularly when it comes to micropayment, it is quite easy and the incremental cost of adding a micropay onto a mobile bill, but really micro, not these $100 bills or so, because all of a sudden you end up being a credit card company, and that's a competence by itself. But adding very small amounts of money is technically possible and also can be supported by good customer service processes. I think it's definitely one aspect of mobile in the future, and a growing one in its importance.
Yes, I had a different question that I learned that in the 80s and early 90s, we were actually both entrepreneurs, right? You were not.
Well, you were rich and I was not.
I stayed as an entrepreneur, but I was thinking that is an unusual career move. Most people work for a big company, and then become entrepreneurs.
Yes.
You did the opposite. Is this something that, other than you personally, does Deutsche Telekom look to hire people with entrepreneurial experience? Is that an experience that you value as the top recruiter of your company?
Yeah, I do. I do big time. But in many cases, you meet people who started and built companies, and they just hate the idea of being part of a large organization and have to follow all these, policies and procedures, and they hate the long decision processes, and I can very well understand that. However, any one of you who wants to join, let's have a chat, because we need more of that spirit, and we need people who are agile and fast and who are actively pursuing opportunities and have entrepreneurial impetus.
And
but for me, I have to admit, back in '98, or '97, I was just too young to understand what I was going into. I thought, I was a Geschäftsführer at the time of my little company. I was a small shareholder still, and I thought I was entering a big company. I always wanted to run a network and build network services and so forth. I was from a reseller to the network. I felt that was very interesting, and I thought I would also be a Geschäftsführer and I would be autonomous in decision making. So I had to learn my lessons. And it was tough initially. It took me quite a while to get adjusted to that new climate. And there were more than one day where I thought, is this the right environment? But now I guess, since we have changed over the last years, many years, in the last 10 years or so, we've changed. And I think there is room for entrepreneurs in our company.
Well, even very entrepreneurial companies like Google, I recently read an article, have a real hard time retaining employees, right? So it is an issue. Have you been able to retain the key management of the companies you've acquired?
Yes, I think we have a good track record in this regard. The best example, the most prominent example is the United States. And many of the key people who we acquired are still there, i.e. Robert Dodson, who runs our US business and who reports into me. He's one of the guys who was in charge of marketing at the time. He's now the chief operating officer. He's now the CEO since a couple of years. So yes, we have retained, but we also had other cases where people left after the acquisition. So it's not 100%
it's difficult.
Result.
No, I understand that. I've seen it. I know when I sold companies and people had contracts. For example, when we sold Ja.com to Deutsche Telekom, this was like in 2000. People had to stay for a period, I think, of 18 months. And then what happens to some people is that, you see, my employees as a group made 70 million euros, and that creates a lot of inequity between the ones who came that way and everyone else. And sometimes people just want to go, and they just want to build their own companies. Are there any other questions? Yes, over there. Is there a...
My name is Thomas Heutzold from the German paper Die Welt. Mr. Obermann, could you imagine a scenario where companies like YouTube pay you to transport their content to your customers? I mean, really paying for the pipe, not for a nice place on the screen.
Look, they do that today, don't they? I mean, the customer relationship is multifold because there is not just one company having a monopoly on the customer relationship. We have a customer relationship because we support the connection at home, for instance. We also give more and more support to the customers, even including their PC environment. We do the billing for them. We do many other things which help our customers to get access to whatever they want, whenever they want it, and via the network and the device they want it. So we have an integrating role there, but we're of course not the only ones having a relationship to that very customer. Customers have a strong relationship to their service provider on the internet or to many service providers on the internet. And I never intend to be the monopolist with regards to customer relationship. So I'm totally flexible and open. We still have looking ahead, an important role in supporting our customers in providing customer service. From the device to the selection of components to the installation to you name it. There are many things where we need to do a good job in order to make our customers happy. which is, by the way, the reason why we do all this.
I have a related question to that. Is the future of video fiber optics or better mobile broadband?
I think it's
video transport.
I think it's both. If you look at the economics of mobile technologies today, and if you see the, I think in the next couple of years, you'll see such an increase in in demand for bandwidth, that mobile operators will sit on the scarcest resource ever. That is spectrum and the capacity of mobile access. And therefore, even if I was to become, in that regard, a bit pipe, I'm not worried because it's a scarce resource. There's more and more demand for bandwidth and for access capacity. I do believe that will still have a price, first of all. Second, it'll be very tough to cover everything with mobile because today's technologies and the amount of spectrum available, I don't think is going to suffice because the explosion of traffic is just immense. So we'll have to have more than just one technology. It has to be hybrid. I'm firmly convinced it has to be hybrid. And even on the backbone side, you have to have the broadband capacity.
Okay. What question there? Yes, Dr. Buda? No.
Last question.
There's another question here.
Yes, Tal Gavoli, Amdocs. So this brings me back to the question that Martin you had earlier about your vision about no more minutes or no more measurement. Now, and the latest mention you just said, well, it's not going to be sustainable because bandwidth demand is going to go so much higher. So when do we really see this unlimited, all-you-could-eat being pervasively used? I mean, what's your best prediction, and how does it become sustainable, given that demand for bandwidth goes up while the resource is scarce?
You're from Amdocs?
Yes, I am.
We use your product in a number of markets, and the reason why you are so rich is because all these complicated tariffs, right? but it's good, very good software, very good products. Look, you see it today. I mean, the markets are aggressive, more and more aggressive with bundles and competition. Both in fixed line as well as in wireless. In fixed line, you see 25, 30 euro price points for basically not all you can eat, but for a good bundle already, a big bucket. And you see it in mobile also increasingly happening. So I don't think we're far away from that. And so hopefully billing becomes easier, and hopefully we don't need so much money for new developments all the time.
Well, and I can partly give you an answer to that because it did happen, but it happened it really happened in the fixed world.
Yes,
I think in the fixed world, whether in Germany, in Spain, throughout Europe, partly in the States too, now people give you, for a certain price, all the internet you can eat, all the minutes you can talk, TV sometimes included. So it did happen in the fixed world. But I understand that there's a lot of constraints in the mobile world, especially on spectrum, and that's why it continues to be what it is, that spectrum is not unlimited. Any other questions before we finish? Okay.
But even there, I mean, the price points are the critical factor. Price points $39, you have 1,000 minutes or so. Or in Europe, you have price points of whatever, 25, 30, and you get domestic big buckets of 1,000 minutes or whatever. I mean, these price points are coming, and they're taking more and more of our customers take those offers.
Okay. Do we have a minute, or are we done? Okay. Just that one question myself.
Time.
Yeah, there was. How are we doing? Okay. Last question. Netbooks, right? I've seen them explode like they didn't exist, and now, to me, what's so unusual is that this seems to be the first time that telecom operators really get into selling computers, right? That now they're almost sold like phones, right?
Well,
these mini laptops.
Well, mind you, I have 3 devices with me who I would consider a computer. This thing has 16 gigabyte, and a few years ago, no PC had 16 gigabyte. Or this thing is also if you want a small computer. And netbooks were one of the hottest selling devices in the last couple of months. I mean, they went really by tens of thousands. Also, what we call the dongle in the UK, for instance, one of the hottest selling devices. So you turn every laptop into a connected laptop, wireless connected network. Basically, the internet becomes mobile, and the internet mobilization will have a bigger impact on people's lives and work than the internet has had so far.
I agree with that. Well, thank you very much. I think it was a good talk, and thanks everybody for joining
Thank you.
us.
Thanks.